Thank you for taking some time to visit with us and be a part of a historic event. Today is Saturday, May 4, 2024. We're here at our family farm in Lake Benue, and we're so honored to have Dr. Don McAdams going to share a great history and his book presentation, Ellen White and the Historian. And to introduce him, my cousin Tim.
Good afternoon. Welcome to our special meeting with Dr. Don McAdams. We welcome all y'all. We go back to 2023 in January when his book, Ellen G. White and the Historians, was first published, and I read it, and I talked to Denny. I said, boy, I'd really like to meet this gentleman. He's very knowledgeable and a wonderful author. So he said, I went to school when he was the president of the college, the Southwestern Adventist University. I said, well, let's get together. And so the rest is history. And fortunately, today he is here with us. And so I'm going to turn the meeting over to him. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here for several reasons. One is I live in Houston, and what a beautiful drive I had coming up here, seeing mountains, and this time of year everything is green. It reminds me of the good times I spent at Southwestern. I was president at Southwestern from 1975 to 1984. Anybody remember that far back? Couple? Bill Elder was the president of the Arkansas-Louisiana Conference. He was a good friend, board member, one of my trustees. Bobby Ryder in Oklahoma, Don Sullivan in New Mexico, and Cyril Miller in Texas. And I was on that faculty on that. I was president for those years, and they were supportive and helpful. And being here reminds me of those days. I had good times at Southwestern. They were very good times. And yeah, Denny was a student. In fact, he was an actor in one of the plays that the English department put on. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm glad to see you all. Now, the title of my comments today is Ellen White, Our Prophet, Our Treasure, and Our Challenge. And this is sort of a historical presentation. And I hope it is not boring because I'm going to give lots of facts, dates, names, and I'm going to even quote some rather lengthy passages. This material would really take a semester in a college course. And all of these books here, if you were my students in a college course, I would have you become familiar with all of them and read portions of all of them, and maybe read some of them all the way through. So I'm going to try to squeeze all that in to about 90 minutes. And we'll have some questions at the end, and I'll answer them then. I don't want to take questions while I'm going because a lot of stuff is going to come anyway, and I'd like to give it out in the order in which it makes the most sense. So that is my message. Ellen White, our prophet, our treasure, and our challenge. Now, I'm not going to refer to these notes a lot, but I have a lot here because there's so much specific data and things I want to quote. But I want to point out to you that Ellen White came on to the Adventist Church as basically a founder, a co-founder. There would not be an Adventist church today, I don't believe, without Ellen White. And when first we had her visions, and then we had her testimonies, and then later we had her books. And all throughout this time, we had her guiding and counseling and influencing the church. But we've always had a challenge. And the challenge was, it turns out, there were really two. Some of the testimonies were really unfair. And there's lots of details to back that up. I can't get into all of them. And it turns out that many of the books people were noticing were very similar to other books. So there was the question of what we might call borrowing. I don't like to use the word plagiarism because that is a legal term that it implies some legal offense. And so that's really not the issue. The issue is originality and accuracy. And so that is what we have. And I'm going to tell you a lot of history, and a lot of it is going to be my own history, because I had the good fortune to live through the 70s when a lot of this research was coming out. So I want to start back with what George Knight calls the wonderful world of Ellen White. I grew up in Tacoma Park, Maryland, in the 50s and in the 60s. Any of you remember the 50s and the 60s? It was a golden age in many ways for the Adventist Church. We knew what we believed. There were no doubts. There didn't seem to be any threats. There were not really any significant schisms or, people pushing back, breaking off. And if we had any questions, there was Ellen White. I was a child of the church. I grew up in Tacoma Park. My father was a member of the General Conference. All those years, he was the associate director of the publishing department of the General Conference. And I went to Tacoma Academy. I went to Columbia Union College. And it was wonderful. The Adventist Church, we have some wind here today. The Adventist Church was really my extended family, and it still is. And I love the church, and I cheer when the church does well. And it hurts a little bit sometimes when the church doesn't do well. But I grew up in that golden age when we did have Ellen White as an authority. I don't know if you remember the Red Books. You'd have a Sabbath school class, you'd be sitting around in a discussion, some topic would come up, and someone would put out an Ellen White quote. End of discussion. That's it. The prophet said this, end of discussion. We'd move on. No one would say, wait a minute, I don't agree with that. I think she's wrong. That was just unheard of. And everything she wrote, she saw in a vision. That's what we were taught. That's what I believed. Everything she wrote, she saw in a vision first, and she wrote it out. Now, in 1963, I graduated from Columbia Union College. I was a history major. And in fact, I had a professor, Joseph Grady Smoot, who was a great influence on me. I would say next to my parents, he's probably the greatest influence on my life of anyone. And he convinced me that I should become a historian. I had started off at Columbia Union College taking a history major, intending to go to law school. But I had so much fun with history, and Dr. Smoot pointed out to me that I could get a job where people would pay me to read history books and talk about them. What a deal! How could I pass that up? So I ended up getting a scholarship to go to Duke University, full ride, paid for 4 years, and it was a great experience at Duke. And there was a little Durham church. Duke is in Durham, North Carolina. There was a little church there, maybe 60 members, maybe 40, 50 regularly. We would see, maybe 40 on a typical Sabbath. And as soon as that little church found out that I was a college graduate, they elected me as an elder. And when the pastor, who had 2 other churches, couldn't be there, they expected me to preach. So pretty soon I was pretty deeply involved in that local church. Now, my second year at Duke, in the fall of the year, in the autumn of the year, I was taking a course in the French Revolution. The professor was Francis Ackham. I remember all this very clearly. And the conference evangelist, his name was Archer Livengood. He was sent out to Durham to conduct an evangelistic series. And that was really an interesting show. Archer Livengood and his wife lived in a little trailer, travel trailer they had. And they pulled that up in the Durham church, parked it right there at the church. And they lived right there. So this is a low-cost evangelistic series held right there in the church. And, of course, being an elder of the church, a busy graduate student, a lot of stuff to read and papers to write, but I felt obliged to go to the meetings, and I did. As a matter of fact, I even invited some of my fellow graduate students to come. I had a neighbor, Tom Anderson, a young man getting a PhD in mathematics. He and his wife came, and so one night I'm there, and Archer Livengood starts talking about the French Revolution. And he started making mistakes, saying things about the French Revolution that weren't true. So after the meeting was over, I went up to him. I'm a very young man. He's an evangelist, important person. I go up to Archer Livengood, and I say, Elder Livengood, you would probably be wise, I think, if you would just not say some of these things about the French Revolution, because in fact, it didn't happen that way. Young man, he said, come with me. And I followed him into his trailer, and he pulled off the shelf, Great Controversy. He opened it to the chapter on the French Revolution, and he read to me. And he looked at me and said, there it is, young man. So I shut up. I knew then there was a problem. I knew there was a problem because I knew from my class and from the reading I'd been doing that there were things about the French Revolution in Great Controversy that were wrong. And I put it in the back of my head that someday I was going to have to figure this out and dig into that. But I was too busy. I was a graduate student. So I tucked it away. Now, a few years later, I graduated, thanks be to God, and was offered a job at Andrews University. And I was thrilled. It was a great honor to be hired at Andrews University. That was the new university the church had created. It was going to be the premier institution. It was going to get lots of money and support from the General Conference. It was going to become the leading educational institution in the church. And I was very excited to be hired there. And the president at the time was Richard Hamill. He was not the first president of Andrews. He was the second one. The first president of Andrews was a man who had been there before when it was Emmanuel Missionary College. You all probably don't remember this. It was a big discussion at the church at the time. They had a theological seminary in Washington they called Potomac University. And they wanted to merge it with a college to create a real university. And there was talk about merging with Columbia Union College and having the university out in Spencerville area or where to put it. And the decision was made to put it in Berrien Springs, united with what was then Emmanuel Missionary College. And it would be Andrews University, named after a great scholar, early pioneer in the Adventist Church, the first church authorized missionary to go overseas. He went to Switzerland. And you all probably have heard the name of John Nevins Andrews many times, and I'm going to come back and talk about him a little bit later. So I go to Andrews University, and Richard Hamill was determined that Andrews University was going to be a real university, really serious. And he started hiring young PhDs, many from some of America's most prestigious universities. Young men with PhDs from Harvard, University of Chicago, Duke, University of California at Berkeley, just, premier universities, Northwestern, and of course, we're all there. What did we have in common? Here's a physicist, here's a mathematician, here's a chemist, here's a historian. What do we all have in common? The fact that we're Adventists. That's what brought us there. We're Adventists. We share that. And so when we get together to talk, we're trying to be intellectuals here, and we would ask each other, so, in your discipline, what is the contribution it makes to the Adventist Church? As a mathematician, as a biologist, as a chemist, how does your work, how does your area of research fit in with Adventist belief? And we would have these conversations. They were widespread. Also, remember, the church leaders wanted us to bring Christianity into our teaching. And they wanted us to bring Ellen White into our teaching. And I'm teaching history, and naturally Ellen White wrote a lot of history, so I'm trying to bring Ellen White into my classes when I talk about history. All makes good sense. Well, it turned out that all of us discovered we had problems. The chemists, they had some problems with things that Ellen White had said. The physicists, they had some problems. The biologists, the historians, everybody had some problems. Because Ellen White had made comments about history, about science, about, biblical exegesis. She made a lot of comments, and they would start pushing, and I'll give you one example, and that was, how old is the earth? Ellen White was very clear. It was 6,000 to 10,000 years old, the old Usher chronology. And meanwhile, the scientists, the chemists, the physicists, the biologists, they're coming up with evidence, lots of evidence, really pretty unimpeachable evidence, cross-checking evidence that showed that the Earth is a whole lot older than that. What do you do? And then they're historians, people like me. Here's what Great Controversy says, but here's what we know. Here's what we're reading in, modern historical research. So we all start talking about Ellen White. It was inevitable. Now, it would have probably happened sooner or later. But about that time, a group of young graduate students started the Association of Adventist Forums. You might remember that. It was designed as a place where the graduate students, the Adventist graduate students at Harvard or MIT or Berkeley or wherever, could get together and talk about religion. And they came out with a journal, which they called Spectrum. And it was first published in 1969. And in the autumn of 1970, there was 2 articles in there that were very important. So you need to remember this. Spectrum, autumn 1970. One was an article by Roy Branson and Weiss. And Branson and Weiss wrote this article, and it called on scholars to study Ellen White and understand her in her context and in her time. That was sort of a challenge. There was also a short article in there by Bill Peterson, William S. Peterson, who was a colleague of mine right across the hall, who was an English professor. His specialty was late 19th century Victorian literature. Now, Bill and I had talked about my experience at Duke with the Great Controversy. There were others we were having conversations. And Bill decided to write an article about Ellen White and the French Revolution. And he did. It was just a short article. It took him one afternoon. Bill, still around, a friend of mine, very smart, quickly knocked off this article. And what he did, he showed that the historians that Ellen White used when she wrote the chapter on Great Controversy were not very good historians. They tended to be biased historians, not very accurate, and she didn't even use them well. That's what he alleged in his article. And it was published. This is the fall of 1970. Uproar. I mean, the brethren in the General Conference were very upset. The White Estate was very upset. The chairman of the Board of Trustees of the White Estate wrote a rebuttal, a critique. There was back and forth published in Spectrum. And Bill was so frowned upon that he, in fact, left Andrews. Now, the interesting thing is that a year or two later, Ron Graybill, who was a young associate in the White Estate, he was getting a PhD at Johns Hopkins, and he had been hired by the White Estate to, add some scholarly background to digging into understanding and all the records they had. He wrote a paper critiquing Bill Peterson, and he pointed out something very interesting. In fact, Ellen White's chapter in The Great Controversy on the French Revolution was basically just taken from Uriah Smith. It was taken from Uriah Smith's book, Daniel and Revelation. And Uriah Smith had gotten most of his information from Sir Walter Scott, who wasn't even a historian. You may remember Sir Walter Scott, a famous British novelist, wrote historical novels. He had written a book on the French Revolution, and he was the basic source for Uriah Smith, who was the basic source for Ellen White. So no wonder there are some historical errors in there, because they go all the way back to Sir Walter Scott. That's an interesting point. So there's this buzz now. And here's where I get into the buzz. And here's where my book comes from. Let's see, where is my book? Here's my book. This book is, in fact, a paper that I wrote in 1974. Never published until just a year and a half ago. And so I need to tell you about that paper because primarily what I'm trying to do today is talk about my book and the history around my book and what was going on in the 70s, and then spring back and look at maybe the Bible Conference of 1919 and show you a pattern that is extremely interesting, I believe. How did I get into this? Well, Bill Peterson had written his article. There was a lot of discussion. And a student came to me. The students at Andrews had a book club. And they wanted a professor to recommend a book that everybody would read. And then they were going to get together on a Sabbath afternoon and discuss the book. And they had done this for several months. And the students came to me and said, Dr. McAdams, would you recommend a book that we can all read and we'll come together and discuss it? And I couldn't think of anything, so I said, I can't think of anything right off. But then a month later, they came again, and this time I had an idea. At the time, I was teaching a course in English history, the history of England. And all of you know something about the English Reformation, right? Henry VIII, with all of his wives and his break from the Catholic Church. We all know that story a little bit. Well, if you looked at all the historians writing about the English Reformation in the 20th century, they were talking about it in economic terms, in political terms, in power terms. The Reformation was driven by greed. Henry VIII and his nobles wanted to get hold of the wealth of the monasteries. It was driven by an anti-papal attitude, not a religious thing. And I had just been reading a book by A.G. Dickens. And A.G. Dickens, a respected English historian, had written a book on the English Reformation, making the point that it was driven primarily by religious enthusiasm for Reformation. And I thought, this is wonderful. The English Reformation was a spiritual movement. It was a religious movement, just like Ellen White says it was in The Great Controversy. It wasn't all about Henry VIII and his wives. It wasn't about seizing the wealth of the monasteries. It was a religious movement. So I said to the young people, I said, here's the book. You read it. I'm going to read it, and we'll discuss it. So I'm preparing for this discussion. And I decided I should go back and look at The Great Controversy very carefully and see what Ellen White said about the English Reformation. And I ended up writing an 8-page paper on the chapter in Great Controversy on the English Reformation. And what I discovered when I wrote that paper was that her source was Merrill Daubeny, J.H. Merrill Daubeny, a 19th century historian who had written a book called The History of Protestantism, or something like that. I forget the exact title, The Reformation. I think it was multi-volumes. That was her source. I was able to compare line by line, paragraph by paragraph, and I was stunned. So what should I do? Well, I decided that's only one example. I need another example. So I picked, sort of arbitrarily, the chapter in The Great Controversy on Huss and Jerome. Now, I don't know how well you all remember your history, but you remember that the Protestant Reformation, we identify starting with Martin Luther in the early 16th century, right? He nails the 95 Thesis to the church door in Wittenberg in 1519 or something. That's when it started. Well, 100 years before that, there was a kind of a Reformation in Bohemia, which is today the Czech Republic, and also in England. In England, there was a man named John Wycliffe, and then a man named William Tyndale, who had translated the Bible into English. And in Czechoslovakia today, at those days called Bohemia, there was a big sort of Reformation led by John Huss in the chapel there, the main church of the university. And that is a chapter in Great Controversy. There's a chapter in Great Controversy on Huss and Jerome. So I decided I would pick that chapter and examine it to see what was really going on. So I wrote another paper. This one turned out to be 105 pages long. And what I did is I then lined up in one column everything from James A. Wiley, who was another historian who wrote a book, The History of Protestantism. And then I put another column over here, which was The Great Controversy. And it took 105 pages to do this, because this is all on a typewriter. This is the old days, all on a typewriter. And it was clear that this material in The Great Controversy on John Huss had been taken directly from James A. Wiley. It was clear. So what would you do if you were a young professor at Andrews and had that information? You've seen your friend Bill Peterson gone. What do? Well, I'm a loyal son of the church. My father's in the General Conference. I wrote a paper. It's 105 pages long. I made about 20 copies. And I sent a copy to all the people upstream from me. That is, I'm a lowly assistant professor, right? So I sent one to my department chair, Dick Schwartz, to the dean, to the vice president for academic affairs, to the president, to the chairman of the board, to the director of education at the General Conference, to the director of the White Estate, and to the book editors at the Review and Herald, who are the scholars. And I sent it to all these people, including General Conference men who were on the Andrews board. I sent out about 20 copies with a covering letter. And in this covering letter, I said, gentlemen, they were all men. I said, gentlemen, you have a problem. I don't have a problem. I'm just the messenger. I'm just bringing you this information. You have a problem. It's pretty clear that Ellen White is taking her history from a historian. There's no evidence here that she saw anything in vision. What are you going to do about this? How many answers do you think I got? Virtually none. One or two called me on the phone and said, I think you're right, Don. You're onto something. Several sent me a little note that said, thank you, I appreciate receiving this. Richard Hamill, the president of Andrews, a man I greatly respected and still, well, he's now deceased. He called me up and said, Don, you need to put this in the Heritage Room at Andrews University Library with a ban on anyone seeing it for 5 years. It's too hot for right now. Okay? So that's what I did. That's what happened. The church leaders were not interested in the facts. Oh, but the story goes on. It gets even more interesting. This is in the spring of 1973. I had started my work in the winter of 1971 with a little paper on the English Reformation. It's now the spring of 1973, and I finished this longer paper dealing with Huss, sent it to the brethren, and basically gotten no response. That summer, the summer of 1973, I was in Washington, D.C. to spend the summer doing research on Adventist history. I was very interested in Adventist history, and I was actually doing research on the history of the publishing work. But I spent a lot of time in the White Estate. There was Arthur White, the director, young Ron Graybill, about my age, a budding scholar, not yet finished with his PhD at Johns Hopkins. And I was there on and off all summer, 1973. And about 3 days before I was due to quit and go back to Andrews University, Ron Graybill calls me aside and says, Don, I want to show you something. Now, I want to give Ron Graybill credit for this. I'm not some great researcher who discovered this by myself. Ron Graybill said, I want you to see this. And he pulled open a drawer, and in that drawer were stacks, sort of loose. There weren't files. They were just laying around this way. It was a thin drawer. It wasn't like a file drawer. And they were just pieces of paper all laying around, and they were large pieces, long pieces like legal pieces, and they had all scribbling on them, and they were brown with age. And he said, we believe that these are all handwritten Ellen White drafts. They're what historians call holographs. They're the original handwritten document. And I believe this is Ellen White's handwriting. And he said, this particular stack here of about 80 pages, I believe is the rough draft for the chapter in Great Controversy on Huss. Because see, you can see the name Huss stuck in here and there on the front page. Now, at the time, I thought that was providential. Here I am, I've been studying Huss. I already have double columns, where I'm showing the source and what was published in Great Controversy. Now I have the handwritten rough manuscript, the first draft. So I immediately went to Arthur White. Now, Graybill said, don't mention my name. Those were the days, folks. You may not remember the 70s, but those were the days. So I went to Arthur White and I said, Elder White, I have become acquainted with this document. I had it in my hand. And I said, I believe it is probably Ellen White's rough draft of the chapter in Great Controversy on Huss. And I would like to transcribe it. It was basically unreadable. I knew it was going to take weeks and weeks to transcribe it. I said, I would like to make photocopies of it take it back to Andrews. I'm leaving in a few days, and transcribing it into TypeScript. Will you give me permission to do that? And he said, only on one condition. You have to give me your word that when you're done with the photocopies, you send them back to me. You don't keep a set. Number two, you don't publish it or circulate it. I gave my word. Now, folks, that meant something to me then, and it still does. And so I gave him my word, and they made the photocopies for me. The set. I took it back to Andrews, and during the fall of 1973 and the spring of 1974, I wrote this paper, and here it is. This is the original typed paper, and this one has the title of Ellen G. White and the Protestant Historians, the Evidence from an Unpublished Manuscript on John Huss. This is the original typescript, and I took it to, when I got done with it, I took it to the Andrews University bindery. They had a bindery there, and they bound it for me like a book. So here it is, the original copy. Now, I sent my final work to Arthur White. And before I did, I asked him, I got permission. I said, Elder White, scholars don't like to go out with something until they've gotten some critique on it. And I want your permission to circulate this to 3 or 4 of my closest friends, scholars, and have them tell me if they think I'm on the right track and correct any errors and mistakes, because everybody makes them. And he said, that's okay. So I made 4 copies, and I gave them to 4 different Andrews University professors, and I said, these are for your eyes only. No copies, don't show it to anyone else, but I want you to give me feedback and point out anything you think I've said that is not true, anything that is wrong, anything that could be said better. So they did. And then about a month later, I'm waiting for a response from the White estate. About a month later, someone says, by the way, Don, a copy of your paper is circulating at Loma Linda. How did that happen? And then I found out that another copy was circulating in Tacoma Park. And in fact, there were some copies all over the place. Now, the laity of the Adventist Church didn't know anything about this, but professors at Loma Linda, at CUC, at other Adventist colleges, and some of the people in the medical community, they were reading this. And so I quickly, told Arthur White, look, this is not me. I did not leak this. Somebody else did. And by the way, guess what? I know who leaked it. How do you think I know? What do you think? Well, what I did was I made a typographical error that was different on the 4 copies. So once I got a hold of the copy that was circulating, I knew who the leak was. And to this day, I know who that person was, and I've never told anybody. I decided it's not worth. If I accosted him, he would say, "Well, I didn't do it, but I did let a friend read it." And the friend promised he wouldn't, And then the friend would have said, "Well, I loaned it." I could have never pinned it down, and I'd have lost a friend. And I just said it's done. And so my paper in 1974 circulated and really started the ball rolling. Because unlike the Peterson article that had said she made some mistakes in the historians she used. She didn't use them properly. I have proof that she's copied it. And I'm going to share that proof with you in a minute. But I want to talk about the history of the paper before I get into what is now in my book. Now, when Arthur White got that, he didn't particularly like it. There's about a 40-page introduction. And then there are the triple columns. There's column 1, which is James A. Wiley, History of Protestantism. Column 2, which is Ellen White's handwritten rough draft. And then column 3, which is what was published in Great Controversy in 1988. And you can trace it, you can see it. And I'm going to talk a lot about that in a minute. But the 40 pages that I had written introducing it really talked about the history of Great Controversy, how it developed as a book. Now, you might be familiar with this already, but I suspect that some of you aren't, so I'm going to share it with you. And I hope I'm not being too tedious. There's a lot of detail here, but it's really important if you want to get to the truth. Ellen White first had a vision in March of 1858. March of 1858, she had a vision in Lovett's Grove, Ohio, which she said revealed to her the great controversy theme and the great story. Right? That was volume 1 of what we call spiritual gifts. Volume 2 was autobiographical, and then volume 3 and 4 dealt with the biblical period of history, patriarchs and prophets, Christ and the apostles. But the great controversy, that was the title she gave to that first volume of spiritual gifts, dealt with the history of the Reformation, basically, and the last days. There were actually only about 29 pages in that book that actually dealt with history between the sacking of Jerusalem in 70 AD and her own lifetime. Now, she decided to expand that into a 4-volume set. And that 4-volume set, the copy of that 4-volume set that it was Great Controversy, came out in 1884. Some of the other ones, what later became Prophets and Kings and Patriarchs and Prophets, they came out at different times. But what you might call the second edition of Great Controversy came out in 1884. And then she kept expanding it, a lot more history. And then she came out with another Great Controversy volume in 1888, which is really expanded. In fact, that's essentially the book we still have. There were some revisions made in 1911, and that's an important story I want to talk about later. But there are actually 4 different editions of Great Controversy, you might say. Now, I laid out all that story in the introductory chapters and talked about the background of that. And that's worth reading, by the way. It's interesting. Arthur White didn't like some of it, and he wanted me to take this out and add this. Because when I'd given it to Arthur White, the deal was, Don, when you give us something, and we want to work with you to make sure that it's your best effort, then we will give you an official response from the church. So now here I'm negotiating with Arthur White, and take this out, add this in, so forth. I did all that. That negotiation lasted from 1974 until 1977. And guess where I was during that time? I was right here in the Southwest as president of Southwestern Adventist College. So that was going on. The students didn't know about it. Now Ben Leach knew about it, my board president. I was very open with everybody. I felt I had nothing to hide, and I didn't feel like I'd done anything wrong. I was bringing something to the attention of the church leaders and expecting them to do something with it, right? So that's the second edition, you might say, and here's a copy of that. So you can read what I wrote in 1974, and again, you can read what I wrote in 1978. The rest of it is all the same, but just that introductory material. Now, that copy they received in 1977, mid-year. In fact, it was even at Autumn Council I was still negotiating with Arthur White. And he still wanted more changes. And I finally said, no, Elder White, that's enough. I demand the opportunity to present this to my peers in the Adventist historical community. So every year between Christmas and New Year's, there was always a meeting of the American Historical Association. This was the major professional organization for historians. And at that meeting, the Adventist historians would always meet on their own and have other meetings. In fact, we had organized ourselves into a group called the Association of SDA Historians, which, by the way, still exists today. I was the first president. I'm proud of that. It still exists to this day, and now it draws big crowds every year when they have their meetings. I said, I want to present this to my colleagues. I know I can't show them all the data, I can't show them the triple columns, but I want to present to them my 40 pages and my conclusions. And I did. And that was written up in Spectrum by Eric Anderson, published in 1978, and he referred to what I was arguing as the new orthodoxy. What I was arguing in that 40 pages, and I want to get into this. I hope this is not too tedious for you. This is history, and this is the backstory you've never heard before. When he started digging into this, and when I started digging into this, I concluded that Ellen White had been actually pretty open about the fact that she was borrowing stuff from others, that lots of people knew about it, and she knew they knew, and didn't have a problem with it. And I had a nice Ellen White quote to show that. And so Eric Anderson said, that's the new orthodoxy. Now, by the way, it does mean that she's no longer an authority on history, but it does explain, does acknowledge that she knew what she was doing and was just writing stuff to fill it in and, help her tell the story she wanted to tell. That's basically the story of how my book came to be written. Now, I had promised that I wouldn't publish it, and I didn't. And you might say, well, Don, you finally broke your word because here it is. You finally published it. Well, in 2020 or 21, I've forgotten the exact date, I finally got permission from the White Estate to publish it. The director at the time was Jim Nix, and I wrote him a letter, and he said, yeah, you can go ahead and publish it. So I want you to know, this is not a bunch of heresy here, because I published this with the permission of the White Estate, and the publisher, Oak and Acorn, is an Adventist publisher. Oak and Acorn Publishing is owned by the Pacific Press. I mean, by the Pacific Union, right? It's owned by the Pacific Union. The board is officers of the Pacific Union. So I kept my word. Now the book is out. Now I need to talk to you about the evidence in the book and about what else is in the book. And then I'm going to put all of this in the context of the 1970s because there was a lot more going on. It wasn't just me. I want to talk to you about Ronnie Numbers, about Walter Ray, and about a critical turning point when the Adventist Church almost decided to launch a massive education project to re-educate all Adventists on what the facts are about Ellen White. The church came within a hair of making that decision in 1980 in the spring and then backed away from it. And I'm going to tell you exactly how that happened because I was a part of it. I saw it with my own eyes. Okay? So now let's actually look at this book. When I decided to publish it, I thought, how am I going to show both the 1984 edition and the 1977 edition? And so what I did for that portion of the book, the stuff that the White Estate wanted me to cut, I put in boldface. And the stuff they wanted me to add, I put in brackets and underlined. So you see, this is not just a bedtime escape novel. This is serious. You have to really think about this when you read it. But if you read it carefully, you can see the things that bothered Arthur White. It's very interesting to see what he really didn't want to put out there. And it's very interesting to see what he did want to put in there. So, for example, I had 2 entire pages where I critiqued Ellen White's scope of coverage in Great Controversy. He made me cut it all out. Well, I mean, he didn't make me, I guess. I could have refused. But I'm trying to be cooperative. I'm trying to get along because I want the evidence to get out. Not my opinions. I want the evidence to get out. But by the way, I want to just point something out to you because it's an interesting point. If the Great Controversy is the story of Christ and Satan and the struggle for the true church, how come nothing at all in Great Controversy exists about Islam? Did you ever notice that when you read Great Controversy? So we have the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. That's the beginning of the Great Controversy volume, right? And it moves immediately. The action moves to Europe, right? And the villain is the papacy. And then the action moves to America. And there it's the beast and the mark of the beast and Sunday laws. Those are the threats to God's church. Now, as a matter of fact, when Muhammad came on the scene and Islam spread, this was in the 7th century A.D., hundreds of years following the fall of Jerusalem, there were just as many Christians living east of Jerusalem as there were living west of Jerusalem. There's no mention of any of those in Great Controversy. And then there was the split between the papacy and the Eastern Orthodox. And there's nothing at all in the Great Controversy about the Russian and Greek Orthodox, which was also nearly half of Christianity at that time. Why does Ellen White ignore all of that and just focus? The greatest villain to Christianity has not been the papacy, folks. The papacy was trying to uphold it, maybe not very purely, but the greatest enemy was Islam. It was trying to destroy Christianity. Remember, it overran the entire Middle East, it overran North Africa, it overran Spain. And everywhere it went, Christianity was taken out. That's not mentioned in Great Controversy. And so in my introduction, I'm pointing out that the scope of Great Controversy is really sort of a very narrow, limited look at the real history of the struggle for this Christian church. Arthur White said, that goes out. Take that out. We don't want to raise that point. And then also, think about this. In Great Controversy, where do last day events happen? Where do last day events happen? Here. They don't happen in Australia. Sorry, Peter. They don't happen in Europe. They don't happen in Africa, Asia, South America. Where do most of today's Adventists live? In Africa, in South America, the islands of the Pacific. 22 million Adventists. I don't know, less than 1 million in the U.S. How relevant do you think those last chapters of Great Controversy are about the Sunday law and hiding in the mountains to people living in South America or Africa or the islands of the Pacific? And Sunday laws, really? You think they're going to be a problem in Africa or the Middle East or Asia? Those last day events don't, as they're described in Great Controversy, don't really make a lot of sense. And I pointed that out in my introduction material. Arthur White said, let's take that out. So you have the 1974 and the 1978 editions, and in this book you get both. And then you get the triple columns. Now I got to say something about the triple columns. It takes a lot of patience to wade your way through this. I mean, here we go. You can't see it from here. There's no way I can show you this on a screen. A couple of PowerPoints don't make the point. You got to sit there and read it. Here's James A. Wiley. This list of errors was placarded on the door of the Bethlehem Chapel. The tract in which they were set forth was circulated far and near and produced an enormous impression throughout the whole of Bohemia. That's Wiley. Here's the manuscript. Huss's list of errors was placarded on the door of the Bethlehem Church. The tract in which they were set forth was circulated far and near and produced a great excitement throughout Bohemia. The exact words. Well, Marion Davis didn't choose to put that in the final Great Controversy. That's in the rough draft. So when you read this carefully, and there's about 150 pages of this, so it's honestly boring. But when you read it, here's what you discover. Now listen carefully, because this is critical. Roughly half of the Huss manuscript is not history at all. It's what you might call digressions on history. It's reflections that Ellen White is carried off thinking about Cain and Abel, or Christ on the cross, or Satan and his angels. It's not history. It's extra history. It's beyond and outside of the bounds of history. If there's anything that's really spiritual, that's where it is. It's half of the manuscript. What do you think Marion Davis did with all of that? She took it all out. Completely took it out. Okay, of the history that Ellen White took from Huss, Marion Davis, her literary assistant, took out half of that. Now, if Marion Davis had believed that Ellen White was describing what she'd seen in a vision, she would have never taken it out. God goes to the trouble to reveal this to Ellen White. Who am I to say, we're taking that out? And then to top it all off, Marion Davis adds 15% more directly from the source. Ellen White doesn't even see that. She adds it in to fill in some gaps. The background of what's happening is Ellen White was in Europe, and she was in Basel, in Switzerland. That's where John Nevins Andrews, I mentioned him earlier, that's where Andrews was. He had died of tuberculosis. And she is there with Willie White, with Marion Davis, her literary assistant, with several other people, and they are planning a new edition of Great Controversy. Ellen White's been in Europe. She wants to update her Great Controversy so it will appeal to the Europeans. She wants to put more European history in it. And she also wants to add more history because this time the book is designed for the colporteurs. The 1884 Great Controversy had not been designed for the colporteurs, but it was selling. And Ellen White and the publisher, the Pacific Press, realized that there might be a very nice market for this book, but it needed to be expanded a bit and have a little more history in it. So Ellen White is in Basel, and they're negotiating with the Pacific Press. The manager there is a man named C.H. Jones. And, you might think, well, Ellen White says, I'm going to have to write a book because I had this vision. I need to write it out. That's not the way it worked. The way it worked is I'm going to write a book. Now, what am I going to say? And she starts negotiating with the publisher. C.H. Jones had first told them that the book could have a chapter on Huss and another chapter on Jerome, his partner. There's a continuation. We call it Huss and Jerome because Jerome continued after Huss was burned at the stake. Jerome continued the Reformation in Bohemia. But then C.H. Jones says the book is going to be too long. It's got to be compressed. It's got to be cut. So Ellen White's already written the Huss and Jerome chapter in her handwritten manuscript. But now she needs to go to England. So she leaves this with Marion Davis, her literary assistant, and she says to her, look, it's too long. We got to cut it out. We got to cut out a lot of material. And if you need to add stuff to make the story go well, do so. In short, Ellen White knows exactly what she's doing. And so does Marion Davis. And so does Willie White. And so does C.H. Jones. Everybody knows what's going on there. They don't believe that all this stuff came from a vision. If they did, they couldn't possibly cut stuff out that God had taken the trouble to reveal. And they couldn't possibly add stuff on their own to sort of bridge a gap in the storyline. But they did. And you see all of that when you actually carefully go through the triple columns. You see that Marion Davis took the liberty of eliminating all the stuff that wasn't history, half of the stuff that was history, and then added 15% more directly from Wiley to fill in gaps. Now, there's no way you can read all that carefully and conclude that Great Controversy is based on visions. Now, I'm not making that up. And in fact, I wish I hadn't found that information, but I did. And it's a fact, and there it is. And so what are we going to do with it? Now, I decided back then that Ellen White was okay with that. Because after all, there's a lot of interesting facts. The books she was borrowing from, she was advocating their purchase by Adventists. She was in the Review and Herald advertising them. She was encouraging people to read Wiley. She was encouraging people to read Daubonnet. She was encouraging people to read Connie Bear and Howson when they wrote their book on the Apostle Paul. Would she have done that if she was trying to hide something? I mean, it's pretty clear to me she wasn't trying to hide something. She didn't see a big problem there. Now, she does have a lot of statements where she says, I saw scenes of the past and the future. Which specific scenes of the past? Maybe she's not talking so much about the history when she says scenes of the past. I don't know. Now, I'm not taking the position that every claim Ellen White makes is absolutely true. I think some of them, though, we've misinterpreted, and some of them are a bit ambiguous. So when I decided to publish the book, I decided I would also add some other material because the paper is really something of historical significance. It was important in the 1970s, And that's why I decided to publish it so it would get out. But while I was at it, I thought it might be important to put that paper in the context of its time. And therefore, I reprinted an article I had written in 1980 summarizing all the Ellen White research of the 1970s. And I put another paper in there written by Ben MacArthur, who was a former student of mine at Andrews, and he wrote that about 2006. And that gives the backstory of my negotiations with the White estate. It's a whole chapter. It's very interesting. It's a lot of politics. And then there's another chapter by Ron Graybill, which I asked him to write, which deals with the issue of mistakes. My critics were all worried about the errors that I pointed out, and I didn't think they were all that important. I just put them in footnotes. Obviously, if you're borrowing stuff from other people, if they make mistakes, you're going to make the same mistake. But there are people still today who believe that everything in great controversy is historically accurate. and the logic they go through to come up with some of these are quite amazing. So Graybill wrote that article to put that to rest, and you need to read that article if you have questions about the accuracy. And then Eric Anderson finally wrote a chapter sort of saying, where do we go from here? So that's my book. Now, I encourage you to read it carefully. And you don't have to agree with it, but just take a look at the evidence and see what you think. Now, what's equally interesting, maybe even more interesting, is all the other stuff that was going on in the 70s, which leads up to this big potential turning point in the spring of 1980 that didn't happen. Okay? Now, how many of you have heard of, let's see, where do I have my Ron numbers book?
Is it under your second draft?
Thank you. Prophetess of Health. Anyone heard about this book? Oh, it's amazing to see so many people nodding this way. This book was published in 1976. It was hot in 1976. Believe me, it was hot. Prophetess of Health, a study of Ellen G. White. Ronnie, friend of mine, he overlapped with me at Andrews University the school year of 1969-1970. By the way, he's a great ping pong player. He died just a year ago. Really good ping pong player. And a wit. Very, very clever, very witty. He taught with me at Andrews for a year. Offices right there next to each other. That was the year 1969-1970. The summer of 1970, he had a job offer to go to Loma Linda. To do what? To teach the history of medicine to the medical students at Loma Linda University. The dean of the medical school, a man named Hinshaw, Dr. Hinshaw, had decided that medical students, they're going to become doctors, they should know something about the history of medicine. So Ronnie goes out there to teach this class. Well, guess what? Do the medical students enjoy that class? No. No. They didn't want to do the work. They didn't even want to come to class. They're trying to learn to be doctors. It's a heavy load. They don't have time to worry about the history of medicine. They want to learn about diseases and anatomy and physiology. Right, Tim? So Ronnie didn't have many takers. So he was trying to think of what to do. And he tells the story. It's pretty interesting. He found a book, if I recollect correctly, that had belonged to John Harvey Kellogg, that had been written by Ellen White, and with a lot of notations in the margins that led him to believe that this book was similar to other books, and he tried to find these other books, and he found them. In 1971, I started doing my research in the winter of 1971 on the English Reformation. Christmas 1971, between Christmas and New Year's, at the annual meeting of the American Historical Association, Ronnie and Bill Peterson and I go have lunch at a restaurant. I remember this real well. And Bill and Ronnie says, you know what? I'm thinking I might write a book on Ellen White as a health reformer. What do you think? And Bill and I say, well, we've done some Ellen White research. It's fun. It's interesting. You should do it too. We encouraged him. I think his greatest encouragement came from Vern Carner, who was a colleague at Loma Linda. He wrote this book. He had finished it by 1974, but he was being very courteous. He sent a copy to the White Estate. He wanted to get their critique. Well, now, if you'll remember, 1976, they've had my manuscript since 1974. They're working with me. Suddenly, Ronnie Numbers is a problem. I'm dropped. That's one reason why it took so long, 1974 to 1977. They're focused now on Ronnie. So for a couple of years, the White Estate is doing everything they can to keep Ronnie's book from being published. They called the publisher, Harper and Row, said, don't publish this book. Publisher said, we're going to publish it. They said, well, there are a lot of problems with the book. And they came up with a deal. Now, this is a really interesting deal. Ronnie agreed that he would meet with Ron Graybill, young scholar at the White Estate, Dick Schwartz, the chairman of the history department at Andrews, and the three of them would go through his book line by line. And Ronnie said, if the two of you agree that something is wrong and not accurate and shouldn't be there, I'll take it out. But if one of you agrees with me, I'm leaving it in. As a result of that, by the time he got done, the book was perfect. There's not much to, let me tell you, there's not much to critique in this book. It's accurate. It's been cleaned with a fine-tooth comb. And basically, Ronnie's thesis is that Ellen White's health reform message she picked up from the health reformers of her day. She visited their hospitals, their sanitariums, their retreats. She read their books. She went to their lectures. She talked to them. And he lays it out. He gives the names, places, dates, letters. It's very well written. This caused a bombshell in the Adventist Church. It was featured in Time magazine. It was, I would say, almost the most important thing that happened in the 1970s in terms of the research on Ellen White. But it wasn't the only thing. There was also a gentleman named Walter Ray. Anyone heard that name? Okay. Now, somewhere here, I have his book, The White Lie. There's a lot of problems with this book. It's not like Ronnie's book, but I'll talk about that. Walter Ray was an Adventist minister in Southern California. He read my paper. He knew about me. He actually came to Keene to visit me on one occasion. Now, Walter Ray had been a student at Pacific Union College, and among his classmates had been Bob Olson, who in 1977 follows Arthur White as the director of the White Estate, and Neil Wilson, who about that time follows Robert H. Pearson and becomes president of the General Conference. So Walter Ray, good Adventist pastor, sends them lots of letters and documents showing that Ellen White is in fact borrowing stuff for every book she wrote. Not just history, but all of her books. He finds sources. And this whole book is just full of them. Just full of them, page after page after page. Every book you can think of, he takes a look at that book and discovers the sources for that book. Now, Walter Ray was not a scholar. His work was a bit sloppy, and his attitude was bad. It was sort of a nasty. He had grown up being such a believer in everything Ellen White said as the gospel truth that he had memorized fast passages. And he was crushed. He was disappointed. You know, by this time, my father is actually one of the trustees of the White Estate. He had become the director of the publishing department, and he was a trustee of the White Estate all through the 70s here. And I hadn't been raised that way, you know. I had been raised that Ellen White is our prophet, but I hadn't been hammered with her. Well, Walter Ray had. And when he found out all this, he was very angry. So he sends these letters to Neil Wilson and Bob Olson, and they put him off. They put him off. They put him off. And he gets more and more upset. And then in 1979, in May, comes the biggest bombshell of all in the 70s, which is the publication of transcripts from the 1919 Bible Conference. Now, How many of you have heard about the 1919 Bible Conference? Just a few. Well, I mean, this is really big. Here's a book by Michael Campbell of the 1919 Bible Conference. So I got to tell you a bit about this. I'm going to digress a little bit because this becomes a big issue in the late 70s. In the 1890s, following the publication of the Great Controversy in 1888, when it was noticed that there was a lot of borrowing from other sources, the leadership of the church began to discover in more detail how Ellen White's books were written. And W. Prescott, one of the 2 or 3 leading men in the church, a scholar, first-class scholar, A.G. Daniels, president of the General Conference. These men had both been in Australia in the 90s when Ellen White was writing Desire of Ages. And they knew how the system worked. And they were aware of things. And more of the church leaders began to be aware of how deeply indebted Ellen White was to other sources. And they began to discuss it and talk about it. What are we going to do? Well, Ellen White died in 1915. And in 1919, Arthur Daniels decided that they would have a big conference of ministers, Bible teachers, editors, to discuss a bunch of theological issues. And by the way, the 1919 Bible Conference was not called to look at Ellen White. It was called to deal with a whole range of issues. They dealt with the 10 kingdoms, the King of the North, the daily, interpreting Daniel 8, the Trinity. They had lots of discussions about that. There were a lot of issues. Now, in all of those issues, Ellen White's name came up. But there were several times where she was discussed in great depth. Now, this Bible conference actually took place in Washington, D.C., in Tacoma Park. Now, any of you remember the building called Columbia Hall on the campus of Columbia Union College? Anybody remember that building? It was the main building when I was a student there, 1959 to 1963. It burned down about 10 years later, so it's not there today. The Bible conference was held in the summer, hot summer. It was held in the basement during July and half of the month of August of 1919. And they had about 64 people there. There was a big meeting during the day, and then in the evening, after dinner, the Bible teachers would meet separately. The Bible and history teachers would meet separately. And they went on to about middle of August, August 9, I think. And there are several days where there were intensive discussions about Ellen White. And I don't suppose I have time to read you all the quotes from that, but there's just a fascinating amount of material because it turns out that the church leaders understand the problem. And the big discussion is, what are we going to do about it? I think I have to read you some of the quotes. They're just simply too interesting. Give me a minute here before I find some. Here's A.G. Daniels, the president of the General Conference. I saw the Desire of Ages being made up, and I saw the rewriting of chapters, some of them written over and over again. And I saw that. And when I talked with Sister Davis, that's Marion Davis, the literary assistant, when I talked to Sister Davis about it, I tell you I had to square up this thing and begin to settle things about the spirit of prophecy. Here's Prescott. He's speaking to the group. W.C. White, that's Ellen White's son, W.C. White told me frankly that when they got out Great Controversy, if they did not find in her writings anything on certain chapters to make the historical connections, they took other books, like Daniel and Revelation, and used portions of them, the chapter on the French Revolution. And sometimes her secretaries and herself would write additional chapters to fill in the gaps. Now, that's pretty astounding. And but guess what? All the people there, none of them doubted the facts, and none of them abandoned their belief that Ellen White was inspired and a messenger of the Lord. That's an interesting point, don't you think? Here they are, they're acquainted with all these facts, but that doesn't cause them to lose faith. Daniel says, look, I know she was God's gift. I know she was his messenger. The messages she brought us throughout 70 years of this church's history, we wouldn't be where we are today if it wasn't for her. Remember, the Bible says, by their fruits. And by their fruits, I know she's inspired. So they were, in 1919, the church leaders were able to handle the fact that Ellen White was heavily dependent on human sources for her writing and made mistakes. And her books were assisted greatly by a team. At the same time, they had no doubts that she had a spiritual gift. I think that's a really interesting point. That, along with the fact that she herself was encouraging people to read the books that she was borrowing from. We actually have exaggerated in the 20s and 30s her gift. And for that, you need to read this book by George Knight called Ellen White's Afterlife. He goes to a lot of trouble to show you that in the 1920s and 30s, the church began to teach things that would have probably surprised Ellen White. So this Bible conference takes place, and there is a lot of other significance of what's going on there. I wish I could read all this to you. The problem they had was, if we go public with this, we'll get killed. Now, these are not professors at Andrews University. These are not a young assistant professor discovering something. These are the leaders of the church. Eventually they're afraid to tell the membership what they know. Now, it's interesting to note that during the whole Bible conference, Daniels had a stenographer taking notes. Anyone know what a stenographer does? We don't need them anymore. Why? Why don't we need stenographers anymore who do shorthand? No shorthand. We have voice recognition. Yeah. But, the stenographer, my mother knew shorthand. They had stenographers who took everything down, and afterwards it was typed up. And how many pages do you think they had? 2,400 pages. Most of it doesn't deal with Ellen White. There are about 30 pages or so that deal with Ellen White. And by the way, those pages have been reprinted in the back of this book. George Knight's book, they're reprinted in the back of this book. They're also reprinted in the back of some other books. I encourage you to read it. What did Arthur Daniels decide to do with these transcripts? They discussed it. Should we make it public? And some of them say, if we go back in our classes and say these things, the students will rise up in rebellion. We'll be out of touch with the field. We've miseducated our members. They actually say things like that at this conference. I got the quotes right here for people who want to come and take a look. They finally decided that with this transcript, it was too hot to handle, and they buried it. Even so, the word got out, and that Daniels was not reelected as president of the General Conference, and several of the Bible teachers lost their jobs because the word was out there, soft on the spirit of prophecy. Those transcripts remained hidden until 1974. They were discovered by Don Yost. The General Conference had decided to set up an archive, thanks to the work of the Association of SDA Historians, who pushed him to do that. And he came across this. Now, here's the interesting thing, folks. This is my lifetime and yours, some of you. From 1974 till 1979, nobody knew they existed. The church leaders put a squash on it. Not to be seen by anybody, not to be talked about. Arthur White knew all about that when he was negotiating with me in 1974, 75, 76. He never said a thing to me about it. And he knew all about the Bible conference transcripts. That's to be a serious point. And Malaris Caparis, who had been the first editor of Spectrum, discovered that they were there, and since he hadn't actually signed a statement swearing that he would not disclose, frankly, I think it was a little unethical. Nevertheless, he took them out, and Roy Branson, then the editor of Spectrum, decided to publish it, and it was published in May of 1979. And that was the biggest event in the 1970s about Ellen White. Because now this research that Ronnie and me and others have been digging up, we discovered that the church leaders in 1919 already knew all that and were comfortable with it and could handle it. And no one had told us. And also that the church leaders had been sitting on it for 5 years. There was a lot of loss of credibility in the minds of scholars with the church leaders at the time, and a lot of other people. People in the medical community were reading this, and they were, and not just the academic community, and it was a big shock. And it's in this context that the church decided to deal with Walter Ray. I'm almost done, folks. I know this has been long, but this is, to me, really interesting. I hope you find the same. Here's Walter Ray sending these letters, these documents, stacks of them, to Bob Olson and Neil Wilson, and not getting a satisfactory results. Now put yourself in their shoes. It's now late 1970, not 1979. They're familiar with the McAdams paper, though it's never been published. They know all about numbers. They've written, the Bible conference minutes are now out. And here's Walter Ray, who's sort of like a loose cannon, who's now threatening to publish all of his stuff if they don't deal with him. So they set up a big conference. And this conference was to be held in Glendale, California in January of 1980. And they brought together about 20 people to get to the truth about Ellen White's use of sources. And Walter Ray was invited to come in and make his presentation. I was there. I was a member of the committee. I'm probably the only one still alive who was there, because I was about 20 years younger than most of the others. Now, let me just talk about this, because I'm almost done here, but this is really critical. The chair of this committee was G. Ralph Thompson, the secretary of the General Conference. He was the chair. The secretary was Bob Olson, the director of the White Estate. A union conference president was there, a conference president. There were scholars. And here's how it went. The first day, Walter Ray, we were sitting around a square table, sort of a rectangle, and here's Walter Ray at the front with a table in front of him. And he has all of his books laid out. And here we are making sort of a U. And Walter Ray picks up a book and reads it and picks up another. This is Christ Object Lessons. This is so-and-so. And he's reading passages. And he's doing it all day long. And we're not asking him questions. We're just listening. And it's just more and more and more. I think most everybody in that room, except me, was surprised. I wasn't surprised. Okay, that was day one. Day two, in the morning, we now ask Walter a lot of questions. Now, his presentation was not very academic. It was sort of sloppy. He had sort of an angry tone. He was not a likable person from my point of view. But nevertheless, there we are. We asked him a bunch of questions. And then the second afternoon, the decision is we're now going to discuss. He can be there in the room, but he can't say anything. By the way, it was agreed that 3 tapes would be made of this. One for Walter, one for Neil Wilson, one for the White Estate. To my knowledge, those 3 tapes probably still exist. Has anyone ever heard of them? Have they been published? Has the whole fact that this committee existed been known by anybody? See? All this sort of disappeared. At the second day, at the afternoon, we discussed it. And everybody there said, Walter's right. He's right. Now, I was keeping a journal at the time, and just to show you how accurate this is, I'm going to read it to you. It's fairly long, but it's not me remembering it. This is what I wrote that night when I went to my hotel room, the Glendale Hospital, in a conference room there. Now I got to find it here. Okay, I think I did. Ugh. Now, I normally wouldn't like to read a quote this long to a class, but I want you to listen. I don't have the facility here to put it up on the screen. We spent the first day listening to Ray's presentation. We interrupted only to ask questions for clarification. Ray showed himself to be a terrible scholar, a poor and confusing speaker, and a bitter Adventist with a chip on his shoulder. He evaded questions, jumped from one point to another, and never laid out a clear picture of his evidence. It was like being given an unarranged note card stack to read. Also, he basically conveyed the attitude of a disbeliever who looked upon Ellen White as a clever fraud. That's me at night in the journal. But I was so impressed with the committee. No one used these excuses to turn away from the evidence. Everyone present was a person of real integrity. We all acknowledged that Ray had the facts, that Ellen White had borrowed far more than any of us had realized. What I found for great controversy carries over in principle to just about everything she wrote. In some books there are half a dozen sources per chapter, but all is clearly paraphrased. The borrowing goes on through the Conflict of the Ages series, including the Desire of Ages, the Testimonies, and into devotional books. All of these non- or extra-biblical accounts in Desire of Ages of Christ's activities, thoughts, etc., come from others. Copied from others are some of her most famous and frequently quoted passages. On the second morning, January 29, we debated the evidence with Ray, and then in the afternoon made long speeches to each other, allowing him to listen but not take part. We all accepted the evidence. Most told their personal story of when they first discovered Ellen White borrowed, and how they came to terms with this in their own lives. All agreed that this borrowing was consistent with inspiration and pointed to the similar pattern of borrowing by Bible writers. But while we asserted that Ray's material was not alarming to us, we acknowledged it would be alarming to the church. So we urged PRECSED, that's the President's Advisory Council, to begin an immediate and extensive program of education for the church. To my surprise, Olson and Lesher, who later became president of Andrews University, took the lead in this discussion. We went out knowing that we had made history and that the church would never be the same. No doubt this is just the beginning of many meetings I will attend on this topic. That was naive young Don McAdams in January of 1980. Because what happened? We made this resolution. Church leaders are there. They go back to Washington, and sometime in February or March or April, the whole thing is killed. Why? Why do you think? Well, I don't know for sure, but I have a hypothesis to put before you. I visited with Neil Wilson, who was president of the General Conference, a couple of months before this meeting in Glendale. And he said to me, and that's also in my journal, he said to me, Don, I'm glad you're on this committee. We're going to get to the truth, and we're going to share whatever we learn with the church members. I really thought this was going to be something. And then we have this resolution from all these people there. But any of you heard the name Desmond Ford?
Yeah.
Anybody remember the date for Desmond Ford's famous speech at PUC? October 1979. Now start putting this together, folks. What did Desmond Ford say? He said a lot of things. He's a brilliant theologian. But his basic thesis was that salvation ended at the cross. When Christ was sacrificed at the cross, that was it. We were saved. If we believed. And all we had to do was believe. No salvation by works. Salvation by faith in Jesus Christ. He paid the sacrifice on the cross. As far as the investigative judgment in heaven, going through the books, he pointed out that there was no way to establish that fact from the Bible. If you read the Bible, as Bible scholars do, and try to put that together, you can't find it, even though the early church built a lot about that. And as Desmond Ford said, the only way we can hang on to that is by Ellen White. Because she says that it's true, the investigative judgment that other people came up with, right? Hiram Edson, Crozier, and then she endorsed it. Now, think about this. Here are people like Don McAdams and Ron Numbers and Bill Peterson and Ron Grable and others, and we're pointing out borrowing here and there with history and healthcare, etc. None of these are pillars of the church. If they launch a big, widespread re-education of the church on the point that Ellen White is not an authority, are they putting at risk the sanctuary? And unlike us, Desmond Ford is really well known. His tapes are circulating. Thousands of people are listening to them. He's a popular preacher. And I think, this is just my hypothesis, I think that the Desmond Ford issue caused them to say, wait a minute, we can't go forward with this broad re-education of the church on Ellen White. It's too risky, because then it might undermine our ability to hang on to the investigative judgment. Sometime in the spring of 1980, the decision to go forward with re-education was dropped. And instead, the decision was made to hold a big conference in Glacier View in August of 1980. Some of you remember that, where basically Desmond Ford was called in and eliminated from the pastoral ministry. It's complicated. No one came out of Glacier View looking good. It's also interesting to note that summer, at the General Conference session that met in Dallas, midsummer of 1980, for the first time they put out a general statement of fundamental beliefs of the church, which had in it a statement on the authority of Ellen White. And that is still in the fundamental belief statement. Now, I can't prove this, but I think that statement was being developed in the late 70s because of the pressure was building up. And the decision to go forward with re-education of the church was dropped. Instead, they put that in the fundamental beliefs, met at Glacier View, took care of Desmond Ford. And then meanwhile, what about Walter Ray? Walter Ray is left hanging. He heard us vote that resolution saying in the afternoon of January 29, saying that we're going to have a big re-education of the Adventist people. And now he discovers that nothing's going to happen at all. So he proceeds to write a book, and he then makes the front page of the LA Times. It's a big story. You all probably don't remember that. This book comes out in 1982. But it's too late. The boat has sailed, you might say. The train has left the station. Because what the church leaders did in 1980 is two things. Now, let me just ask you this question. I'm about 3 minutes from being finished, you all. You've been very patient. When you're in a leadership position and someone brings you bad news about something, what is the classic way of dealing with that? Politicians do it all the time. There's two things. I'll tell you what it is. Two things. The classic way you deal with bad news. One, you admit as little as possible that you can't avoid to take a little bit of the heat off. And then you launch an investigation or a blue ribbon commission that is going to study intensely and bring back a recommendation. And then the years pass and times change. And I'll give you examples. The students at William and Mary, Washington and Lee in Lexington, Virginia. A couple of years ago, they came to the administration and the board, and they said, we want to change the name of the college. Washington and Lee were both slave owners. So what does the board do? Nope, we're not going to do that. We're going to set up a blue ribbon commission. We're going to give deep study to this. A couple of years later, nothing happens. whether it's the assassination of John F. Kennedy, whatever it is, folks, just look at the classic of response. That's exactly what the church did. Neil Wilson wrote a statement in the Review in, I think, June of 1980, in which he acknowledged a few things. He said, inspiration is not necessarily original, and, Ellen White is not inerrant. That's admitting a few things. At the time, I thought that's just the first of much. But then we're going to launch the Veltman Committee. Fred Veltman at PUC, a biblical scholar, we're going to ask him to study in depth the sources for Desire of Ages. And so we're going to give him a budget, a research staff, and several years from now he's going to report. The Veltman report didn't come out for 5 years or so. When it came out, it was really long, thousands of pages. It was so complicated that no one really paid much attention to it. There were some conclusions that were positive, some that were negative. It basically reaffirmed what the scholars had been saying. It didn't get all that much attention. And by that time, when Walter Ray's book came out, everyone said, oh, well, let's wait for Fred Veltman. Now, if you want to know what actually happened, here's a book on the Veltman report. This has been published just recently by Warren Trenchard, and he's gone out and distilled all of the essence of the Veltman study into one book you can read and understand. So, folks, that's it. What happened in the 1980s was a tremendous flood of research about Ellen White, which fundamentally changed the understanding of those who knew the facts. The church almost came to the point of proceeding with a thorough re-education of the membership. They backed away. The church backed away in 1919 because they were afraid the laity wouldn't understand. They didn't have enough evidence to really take. In 1980, they backed away because they really weren't afraid of the laity then. They were trying to hide things from the laity, to be honest. Now, since then, there must have been 50 books on Ellen White by very good books, really critically important. There's this book by Dennis Fortin, an encyclopedia, everything you might want to know. There's this book written by a collection of scholars, published by Oxford University Press. There are probably 15 significant books. There's this book by Gil Valentine, Ostriches and Canaries, which talks about the background during the 70s. There's no end of books on Ellen White. If you want to read and want to learn, it's out there. Now, I thank you very much for your attention, and we're going to have some questions and answers after a short break. Thank you very much.